Hey guys, it's Raz. All right, so for note session 2, this one you are taking notes on because we will go over most of this in class, but I want you to have these specifics. We're looking at land use, urbanization, and sustainability. So if you think about right where you live, where we live, we have an impact on the environment regardless of the type of place, whether it's rural or urban or suburban. But what's interesting is if you look at the graph of kind of where people live over time, I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? Urban growth has continued to increase. Rural is pretty stable. So when we're looking at our populations, right, we know human population is increasing. The vast majority of that increase is living in urban areas. Now, quick note. When we say urban here, urban areas include suburban areas. So urban and suburban areas are all kind of under the same heading. So technically, we live in an urban area as opposed to rural. Okay. And for the first time in history, we have more urban residents than rural residents in kind of this 1900s, 2000s kind of era. And this is just a cool image to kind of look at those urban areas, right, where the lights in the world are, and how much of I'm always struck by how much of this is still dark, right? How much of it is still not super populated, but our urban centers are condensed. And if you look at the US, kind of this is our major centers here. Take a peek at where we live. We actually live in what's called a megalopolis. It's a bunch of cities that are kind of put together, and our megalopolis runs pretty much from Portland all the way down to Washington, D.C. Really more Boston, but we extend it to Portland because that's becoming a little bit bigger in recent years. So we're basically one big mega city in this area. So when we talk about the idea that more and more people are living in urban areas, we just call that urbanization. So it's when people are moving to cities or suburbs from rural areas. We've always had cities, right? They're not new. But the size of our cities is increasing really rapidly. In fact, it's estimated that about 80% of the US population lives in urban areas. And over here, I have this is 2018. I need to update this, but trends are kind of the same. If you look at the largest cities, right, this is just American cities. They're huge, and we've got lots and lots of people that live in them. Okay. So when we're talking about cities, we typically think like negative things, right? That there's lots of bad environmental impacts. And in some respects, there are, right? We certainly have an increase in pollution. We've got lots of waste products. If you've ever walked around New York City in like the morning before the garbage people have come to get the garbage, you would be amazed at how much waste there is. We also usually have a lot of industry, so a lot of industrial byproducts as well. We get noise pollution. Cities are loud. That's actually a thing that impacts humans, but also other wildlife. We have light pollution, and you see this even here, right? We don't see a ton of stars in our sky, but if you go out a little bit, go out north or go where there's not a whole lot, we see so many more stars. And again, light pollution, yeah, it impacts humans, but it also impacts a lot of wildlife as they're dealing with that. And we also see an increase in airborne pollutants. We've also talked a little bit about heat islands, but this is a big one, that if you are in a downtown area where there's lots of dark surfaces, the temperature can be several degrees higher than in the surrounding area. So we get these little heat islands that will occur. So again, all right, it's a couple degrees warmer, but you're going to be using more electricity and more resources to keep those downtown areas cool and comfortable, right, than you would out in the rural areas. And that leads to lots of other things. Heat will often impact, like I just kind of mentioned, to infrastructure. They occur because of infrastructure. And if you think about what cities are typically built of, right, they're impermeable, dry surfaces. Believe it or not, we actually see an increase of rain and smog in cities, partly because of the surfaces. Now, some places are trying to add in more green areas, reflective surfaces to combat this, and it does work. It's just something that we have to kind of work through. Actually, this picture to the left was a picture, I think, it was a failed attempt, but it was, I think, an energy company that was trying to make a completely sustainable city out in the United Arab Emirates. So like literally in the middle of the desert. It's called Masdar City. If you look it up, you probably could find it. And a lot of their infrastructure was designed to provide natural shade, natural, air movement and that sort of thing, so that they did not need air conditioning. They did not have air conditioning at all. So it can be done. It just takes a lot of planning. Now, again, I mentioned we typically think of bad things. They're not all bad. Cities are typically way more efficient, right? It's easier to get places, it's shorter distances to get places. So we use less fuel and resources to distribute things and people. These are also usually hubs of like universities and research centers. So we're fostering like innovation and education through these. And when we have these dense urban centers where there's lots of people living, we actually have room for land preservation. We leave open space for agriculture, biodiversity, privacy, recreation, all kinds of stuff by keeping people kind of condensed in areas. Now, the bad part is what we see happening with sprawl. So we're going to work with sprawl quite a bit in class. But the idea is that you get this spread of exactly what we live in, low density urban and suburban development moving outwards from that city center. So I mentioned before that whole Washington, D.C., Boston megalopolis thing, right? That is a pretty big example of sprawl. Now, sprawl happens because people don't want to live in those dense suburban areas or dense urban areas. So they kind of move out. Lots of reasons for this. Typically, it's cheaper, right? I can buy a really big home in the suburbs for less than a small little apartment in the city. Cars became cheap and easily accessible. So it was easier for people to move around. Our infrastructure, our road infrastructure increased greatly. So it was easy to commute. Okay. The other thing is we have kind of a feedback loop on this, which I'll talk about here. People leave, you go with them, right? There was less people around, you kind of would follow them. And if you have fewer people in the cities, you have fewer taxes. Okay. If you have fewer taxes, you typically see neighborhoods decline. If your neighborhood's going downhill, people are leaving. More people leave, the more taxes go, right? It's this positive feedback loop here, which led to a lot of people moving out of urban areas. All right. And a lot of times, again, businesses will follow. As you get a lot of these things moving, you end up with blight, which is infrastructure that's been abandoned that starts to kind of break down. It doesn't look good. It's not something people want to live around. They leave too. So we had kind of some issues there, right? I also mentioned the idea of transportation just being easier. So people were able to get out of the city a little bit easier. But again, think about this. We're using more gas, right? We are seeing an increase in gasoline tax revenues. We get highway constructions, right? This is a positive feedback loop in the other direction. This is a positive feedback loop that was feeding people leaving. And actually our money, our tax money, right, was going into transportation because that's what we were using. So what are the solutions? The solutions are several things. First thing is what we call urban growth boundaries. And actually, they've done a really good job of this out west. Like the Oregon area is a big one. I'm pretty sure like around Seattle has some too, where they limit the size of cities. So they use zoning laws to prevent development from a certain point, and they stick to them. We have zones even here, right? If you ask your parents at home, they might be able to tell you like what your house, your property is zoned as. That'll tell you the size of the home that can be built there, the number of families that can live in that home. So again, there's all different levels of zoning. The other thing that we are really trying to do in urban areas is to make them livable. We want to clean them up, provide public transportation, make residents be attracted to stay there. Okay. No, sorry. I'm trying to move myself. Do you see my crown, by the way? I was trying. It's been a boring day. Anyways, so the other thing is to what we call to mix up the land use, to provide mixed land use. So where you would have residential, business, and entertainment kind of all in the same areas. I think of kind of like Blueback Square in West Hartford, right? You've got apartments, you have restaurants, you have like fun things to do. And it's encouraging people to kind of be in their neighborhood, to walk around, and it encourages people to want to be there. So those are some solutions. Okay. We also, as we're building new cities, we're looking at the tenets of smart growth. Now, I'm not going to get into it a ton here. We're going to do a whole design a sustainable city project in class that focuses on smart growth. But again, it's trying to make cities sustainable. People want to be there, and to make them vibrant, right? So we're doing a lot of building up and not out. We're making sure that we have that mixed area. We're providing transportation. We're making them walkable. We're trying to encourage communities, all those sorts of things. Okay. And part of that is mass transit. I just included this because I think this is an interesting image. It's the same number of people in both of those pictures to the right? But that is 270 passengers in one bus, right? Versus the amount of cars that they would need to transport them. If you can build a city where everybody has access to mass transit easily, people will use it. We have tons of benefits from that. And the other thing is the how we can build sustainably. So if we look at like cities of the future and things they're thinking about, either rooftop solar panels or wind turbines, right, can be used. We can have renewable energy sources right on our buildings. This mentions plug-in hybrid cars, and I do think that's something that's going to happen, like more of the electrical vehicles. But the other thing we're seeing a lot of even in cities is like bike rentals, where like you can, put in your money, get a bike, ride it to the next place and leave it. So you have other ways to get around that you don't even have to own anything, that are, not necessarily mass transit, but not your own personal car. We could also have rooftop gardens where we could even grow food, bonus. But if not, even just the rooftop gardens are going to be a nice place to be. They're going to filter rainwater. They're going to do all kinds of stuff, which is nice. They're also designing ways to actually make sure that rainwater gets collected from cities and doesn't run off. And there's a lot of research going on about that. Again, we'll do a little bit with that in class. And the other piece is just making sure that glass and metal recycling is going to be standard and maybe even used in building materials, which would be nice. We'll look at these in class too. This is a long enough video. I'm going to stop now, let you guys kind of wrap up, and we'll talk about some of those loose ends in class. See you later.